Greetings all, this is Ohio Dan. This video is going to be a little bit different than the type of video that I usually make for my channel. And the issue here is depression. And in particular, people feeling depressed and the sort of macro level analysis or view of that, and how I think society deliberately ignores one of the most important factors with this. So this is largely inspired by Stardusk's recent videos on the topic of depression, where I think he makes a lot of good points. I'm going to link his most recent video on this topic, as long as I remember, in the description for the video. So I recommend that everybody watch that video as well. But I want to discuss an aspect of depression that society doesn't seem willing to recognize as important, when it's actually one of the most important and one of the most obvious factors in an elephant in the room type of sense. And that is, while certain people are indeed clinically depressed due to a neurochemical imbalance or a peculiar or particular type of thing going on with that person, an actual illness, while that form of depression is legitimate and should be treated medically through medications or whatever else is necessary, the majority of people, and I feel fairly confident saying this, the majority of people who face depression, particularly in modern Western society, likely have some pretty damn good reasons for feeling that way. There are a lot of good reasons today to be depressed. And it seems like at a macro level, no one really wants to do this analysis. No one wants to say, actually, people are depressed because they ought to be in a lot of cases. Not that it's a good thing, but it is very understandable. Otherwise healthy people will become depressed in many cases if the environment is persistently negative in particular ways. When evaluating things in modern Western society in particular, like the cost of living or the state of affairs between men and women and how we have essentially a gender war ongoing. And I don't want to focus on that too much in this video, but that's definitely one of the things that's relevant, along with the general lack of any good path for people to realistically progress down in life. And I've talked about how both men and women, younger people in general, are lied to about what will make them happy. They're lied to about what their goals should be. Men are sold this idea of being traditional, while women are told all these things about just marry your career and you don't need one man, you can just have 100 different men and no one can shame you for it and all this kind of stuff. Both men and women are lied to from the time that they're basically children about what can lead to their happiness. And instead you have this great dysfunction and lack of any sort of good path that is presented for basically anyone, but younger people in particular today. What do you expect is going to be the result of that? Do you think people are going to find happiness and contentment and a general sense of self-realization from that? Do you think it's going to work out? Or do you think people are ultimately going to be depressed in a lot of cases when that is what they are programmed with? And so it's no wonder why many people in modern Western society are dealing with significant bouts of depression. It just makes sense that when the environment is negative in these sorts of ways, that people are not going to feel too good about it. Now, I want to make it clear in this video, now is as good a time as any, that I'm not saying depression is somehow a good thing. I'm not saying that it is good for you to stay in that state of depression for a period of several months or longer. I'm not saying that this explains all there is to explain about why people are depressed chronically over a consistent period of time. But in terms of shorter episodes of depression, I would say that can last, up to at least a few months at a time, it's probably because of your environment. It's because of all of the conflict and all of the pretend that you're one way when you're really another type of things that are going on in society, where you're supposed to pretend that everything is fine, but many people are struggling to get by. Many people don't have a path open to them to really advance in life. The family situation is shit. The overall dynamic between employers and employees is shit. There are so many things that are just not healthy about society today that it makes sense that you're going to have bouts of depression that you may be able to somewhat get over and fight against, but you're going to continue to struggle with it because the environment is so poor when it comes to many of these things. And I realize that at points in history, life has been far worse for your average people out there. I get that. But not in the same way as it is now. And definitely not recently. Since the 1980s and 90s, things have pretty much gone downhill, at least in the United States, when it comes to your real standard of living and quality of life. And you could get into the gender aspect of this and say that things are worse now for men. That's certainly true. But again, women have been lied to a large degree their whole lives as well at this point for generations, thinking that feminism was going to bail them out and they don't need no man. All these kinds of things that are not going to really lead to long-term happiness. Quite the opposite. It makes sense that men and women, both in their own ways, would be depressed. And I could get into how many women are on medications for this. Men, on the other hand, don't tend to do that as much, but they tend to commit suicide more often. So there's a lot of negativity here, and instead of just acknowledging the systemic nature of this, it's seen as a problem that needs to be cured. And I'm going to get into that more with the latter part of this video. But basically, I think that from what I've observed with myself at least, depression can be a natural safety valve for overwhelming or bleak situations where there is little action that one can take to improve his or her prospects in that environment, compared to a situation, for example, that may be overall worse, where you're struggling to survive and feed yourself. If in that sort of civilization, let's say it's pre-industrial, you at least had a positive role to play within your family network. You at least had an understanding of who you were and what you could accomplish. You could at least work hard in order to feed yourself. Overall, that's a more harsh situation to be in, but that's different than the scenario that we have now where no matter what you do, you can't necessarily have a secure place to live. You can't have a secure family unit because the one person can just walk away at any time. And we know this from a guy's perspective. The woman could just take the kids, take half your stuff, take the house. There's no security with that. Your job security probably sucks if you're working an average job, whether it's in the private sector or public sector at this point. You can talk about the negativity that's involved in all this, and it's pretty bleak in a lot of ways, along with the standard of living and this idea that we're being taught, and this is a really good example, that the economy is fine and everything is recovering and people are getting along well, when in reality the only people that are doing well are basically the ruling class, the wealthy elites. It's going well for them, and there might be plenty of shitty jobs available, but you have to take 2 or 3 of those jobs to either get by that or just give up on that whole aspect of it and just live off the system, or try to preserve your one decent job hoping that the corporation that you work for or the government doesn't just fire you. And I'm not trying to get into the whole government efficiency stuff. Like, there's different angles on what's going on there with the public sector. I realize that spending needs to be cut, but all that's really going to do is put more pressure on the private sector in a lot of ways, and there aren't that many good private sector jobs. So there's a lot of reasons to be depressed, guys. That's the point that I'm basically trying to make here. And this idea that it just needs to be cured because it's an illness doesn't address these systemic problems. Now, how does being depressed act as a safety valve? Well, if you're being overwhelmed and the alternative is to go nuts because you can't really seem to do anything to get ahead, depression is a way to sort of dull or blunt the negative aspects of that. Even though depression in itself is a negative thing, it's a way to sort of go through the motions without investing yourself into something that's just going to make you more frustrated and stressed out, right? It's a natural reaction to stress when it's there for a prolonged period of time and there doesn't seem to be a way to make any sort of headway or progress on things. That's what I've noticed with myself. And I realize it's not a healthy place to be, but what is the alternative? Well, the alternative in many cases could be to embrace delusion and pretend that everything is fine and put a smile on your face until you can't anymore. But there's a lack of efficacy in this approach as well that doesn't usually lead to a good long-term outcome either. In other words, what are you going to do? Pretend that everything is great up until the point where you break down? Pretend that the economy is wonderful and all these experts know what they're talking about, even as the cost of living continues to increase while your wages probably don't increase? Or if that's not your situation, that the situation between men and women is great right up until your marriage breaks down and she kicks you out of the house. What is the overall benefit of pretending like everything is fine when acknowledging reality, even if it makes you depressed to a degree, might be the better option, because at least you're now dealing with things as they are and being honest with yourself about what your options may entail. Eventually, you want to work your way out of that if you can, but I do find depression to be kind of a safety valve so that you can kind of disengage from a lot of the negativity that may be going on around you. And it's not an optimal solution, but again, it's understandable why people would be depressed. In other words, I do think there is a natural reason for us to be depressed besides just having a neurochemical imbalance. When the environment is this way, I think it actually helps us get through rough situations. I think it actually helps us deal with things that we're not necessarily able to find a positive solution for. The sort of fallback option could be to be depressed for a period of time so that you can actually not fully invest yourself in the stress and the difficulties and instead have a way to sort of semi-withdraw from that, if that makes sense. Again, a lot of people may not agree with that, and that's fine, but I think depression makes sense when you don't have very many other good alternatives. You're going to feel depressed. It's really just a human thing in these situations so that you're not perpetually stressed out. Ultimately, though, guys, whether you think depression has any sort of role to play when it comes to how we react to these situations or not, or if it's just always negative, I think mainstream society just wants to view depression as something that must always need a cure, because the alternative is to acknowledge how bad things have actually gotten for a large percentage of people, especially in the Western world today. And I'm not saying that things in other parts of the world are better by any means, but again, even in that survival or everything's kind of fallen apart type of scenarios, it does force you to rely more on family, or it forces you to readjust yourself to where at least you have to take some sort of action in order to save yourself and the people that you care about. But to a large extent, that's not what we have. We have basically corporations and the state taking your rights away, making life unaffordable, basically completely tearing apart where things stand between men and women, completely destroying the social contract between the genders through feminism and gynocentrism. And then what else are you going to do, right? Like, you're rewarding people that are in your country illegally or based on some sort of other supposed victim quality or characteristic that other people have, but it's not based on merit. It's not based on hard work. It's not based on your effort. And so the situation is, what are you supposed to do with yourself? And there are a lot of answers that can be provided to these questions. I'm not saying being depressed is ideal. You can walk away from a system that wants to exploit you. You can stop caring about things that are negative. You can completely reorient your worldview. But in the short run, that's hard to do. In the short run, you're probably going to be depressed by these things. And the point of me making this video is to say that that's understandable and is not, as Stardust said, something that is always something that needs to be cured. It's something that actually makes a lot of sense given the shitty nature of affairs for a lot of people today, where there's not a whole lot that they can necessarily do to better their situation other than, again, completely reorient their worldview in a way that's healthier and that allows them to find more value in things that actually can be positive. But in the short run, and even the mid run, being depressed, that makes perfect fucking sense as far as I'm concerned, given some of the things that are going on today and the great difficulties attached to those things. But again, guys, rather than address any of the underlying systemic issues that may legitimately cause someone to feel depressed, most vested interests in this society, most vested interests in the power structure that we have today in the West, to a large extent, without going into any great detail about that, most of them prefer to keep treating depression as an illness that must be cured for everyone that suffers from it, largely with the goal of continuing the illusion that everything is fine and we should just proceed with little overall change to the status quo in society. I do think there's some deliberate mechanism there to make it look like it's these individual people that have the problem, to avoid actually dealing with the underlying systemic issues when it comes to inflation, when it comes to the gender dynamic, when it comes to the corporate world that we live in today, where the corporations and the government basically control more and more and more of the activities in society, where common people are having their rights taken away more and more. Here, put this into your body, or here, we're going to take your right to free speech or bear arms away. As this has gone on, people have become more and more demoralized. There's less and less that you can do to actually go down a viable path towards success, at least based on what the script is that you're given, whether you're a man or a woman today, growing up in this environment. And so to act like depression shouldn't be a natural consequence of this, I think is disingenuous, and I think purposely so to a large degree. I think that is the main reason why depression is viewed as an illness that must be cured. That, along with the idea that you can make a lot of money by trying to cure it. It's just not in the interest of those that have the most at stake in this society, or control most of the wealth of this society and the flow of information and everything that goes along with that, the education system. It's not in their interest to deal with the underlying issues like inflation or the massive, massive amount of debt in the case of the United States, or these issues between men and women. It's not in their interest to actually fix these problems. And so that's why depression is viewed as something that needs to be cured on an individual basis instead, because you'd have to start to admit that things are problematic, and that's the last thing that a lot of these people want to do that actually have influence in society. That's my opinion on this, guys. I think that's the particular reason why this issue of depression is not discussed. That, frankly speaking, there are a lot of fucking good reasons to be depressed in this world today. There are a lot of legit reasons out there to feel this way, and maybe you can still get help, maybe you can still get therapy or medications and whatnot, but really the underlying cause is where we're at in society today. And the fact that we can't even admit that and say that it's understandable that people would be depressed given the situation at hand, and more or less just screw with people even more who come out and say that they're depressed and they want to get help for it or whatnot, basically not even acknowledge these underlying problems. Again, you can test to see why this person's depressed and see if they couldn't get help from some sort of medicine or some sort of therapy. But to a large extent, the problem is just going to continue to get worse as long as these underlying issues aren't addressed. And I think these issues are being avoided on purpose because it's easier to just see depression as something that needs to be cured at the individual level than to acknowledge the problems that we have that are becoming more severe and more extreme over time, at least in Western society as it is today.